Welcome to Living Blind. I'm your host, Naomi Hazlett, and this podcast is brought to you by Balance for Blind Adults, located in Toronto, Canada. This season of Living Blind is sponsored by Accessible Media Incorporated. Here at Living Blind, we explore the perspectives and lived experiences of people with sight loss and delve into barriers, challenges, and real-life strategies for living life to the fullest. This month, I'm joined by Minette Samaroo to share her journey from Guyana to Canada, from incapacity to capability, from exclusion and isolation to social inclusion and empowerment. Born with retinitis pigmentosa and having lived with vision loss for most of her life, Minette was born in Guyana, South America, and migrated to Canada in September 2014. She is employed at Apple Sherway Gardens as a sales specialist. She is currently pursuing a BA in psychology at York University, and since this interview, has graduated from the Assistive Technology Apprenticeship program here at Balance. Since 2017, Minette has worked with the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians, AEBC, to advocate for social change. She has designed and delivered consultations and workshops on meaningful employment, accessible education, housing, and customer service. In addition to her work with the AEBC, Minette is an accessibility tester for Fable Tech and serves as co-chair for the Accessible Housing Network and the Assistive Devices Program Working Committees. Her ultimate goal is to remove inequality, discrimination, and injustice in order to make this world a better place for each of us. We discuss all of this and more within the next half hour, so without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to the show, Minette.
Thank you, Naomi. I am truly honored to be invited as a guest for the Living Blind podcast.
So let's start by talking a little bit about your sight loss journey. So can you tell listeners a bit about what retinitis pigmentosa is and how it's affected your vision over time?
Yes, absolutely. So retinitis pigmentosa, or RP for short, is an inherited retinal eye disease. So it affects the retina and it breaks down cells over time, causing vision loss. So there are many types of retinitis pigmentosa, some severe and some not so severe. So I was born with a severe type of RP where I lost my vision in my late teens. There are people who have RP and lose their vision later on in life, like into their 50s. So for me, growing up, I had day vision. Like, I could live, a normal life during the day. I went to school, played with my friends, and everything was fine during the day. But when it came to the night, like my world was dark. It was like I couldn't see anything. And, as a young child, I didn't understand, what was happening to me. Eventually, my parents noticed, that I was like not moving about in the evening. And so they started taking me to doctors. I was diagnosed with RP when I was 8 years old. And even at that age, like I knew because, I heard the doctors saying that there wasn't a cure. So I knew like someday I would lose my vision. But, when I lost my vision in my late teens, like nothing could prepare me for that. Like I still like, kind of grieve over that loss.
So it sounds like it was something that you knew at first that you were having trouble or you weren't able to really see at night, but it sounds like it took your parents a little bit longer to figure out what was going on.
Yes, they didn't know. They just thought maybe I wanted to, just not do things in the evening, right?
Mm-hmm. So like you said, you grew up in Guyana. What was it like growing up with sight loss in that country?
So it was very, very challenging. Like there was no resources. I heard of an institute for the blind, which was in the city, and I was like 5 hours away by car. And, I grew up in a small town and we couldn't afford to get there. When I was in school and I needed accommodations, like there was no accommodations, no screen reader, nothing. People there didn't understand like what I needed, even though like I explained. There was no government funding for me also. Like even though I became an adult and was no longer under parental support, the government did not support me. I depended on, financial support from family. And I worry a lot because, what will happen if, they stop funding me? What happens to me? So I was really stressed and depressed, and, it was challenging. There's also stigma, like, if somebody has a disability in those countries, then you're looked down upon, like you're like second class citizen.
Mhm. So I'm just wondering, because you said there is no accommodations while you're going to school in Guyana. I guess I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Were there things that you felt like were not accessible to you in terms of learning the curriculum? And then I guess, how did the stigma affect your studies?
Yeah, I had like in when I was writing the exam to go to high school, I had a really, really wonderful teacher then who understood, what I needed. And so like he would teach me one on one. He would take me outside where it had light, and he would, teach me one on one. And when I wrote that exam to go to high school, like he was the one who contacted the Ministry of Health to provide a scribe for me to write that exam, because at that time, age of 11, I wasn't able to read anymore. So I was really happy and excited that, I'm going to high school. But when I got there, like it started to go down where, teachers didn't want to do what my teacher in the common entrance class did. And even though I told them this is how I needed to be accommodated, they just wouldn't do it.
Mhm. It sounds like one of the bigger differences is, your story. You had a teacher who took you under his wing and helped you learn, but that's not something that you could necessarily rely on. Maybe,
Absolutely, yes.
yeah. And then coming to high school, that support was lost, unfortunately.
Yes.
So you said, you finished high school and you became an adult. So at what point did you decide to come to Canada, and what sorts of things influenced your decision to come to Canada?
So I actually did not finish high school. I eventually dropped out because of lack of accommodations.
I see. Did you finish your degree, or is that something
No.
that is that something you plan to do in the future?
So I have already completed that since I came to Canada. And that's why I'm, going to university in September.
I see. So we'll come back to that in a second, but you said you came to Canada in 2014. So can you tell me a bit more about why you decided to do that?
So my mother and sister were already here. And, they talked about Canada being an equal opportunity country. So I saw coming here as my ticket to achieving my dreams.
So what was that process like? I Was there any steps that you had to take to come to Canada? Were there any challenges along the way?
There were many challenges because, I was over age, and, my mom could not sponsor me in the regular way. So my sister being here, she kept researching immigration laws, and she eventually found this process where a parent can sponsor their child, their dependent child, with a disability. And then was how my mom sponsored me. But there were like a lot of challenges. The paper got rejected a few times. But we didn't give up because, I just needed to get out from, what I was going through. I persevered, my family persevered, and eventually we were successful.
I'm glad to hear it. Definitely sounds like there was a lot of challenges when you were in Guyana. So along the way, I think you mentioned, or when I was learning about you, you've become a Christian along the way at some point during your journey. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, how that happened?
So growing up, I was very lonely, even though I have 4 siblings. My parents were, parents who have favorite, and I was not one of them. I was like always the one who couldn't do anything right. And I was like alone. And, like who do you go to when you have challenges, when, your parent is the one who made you feel that way? So I long for someone to love me and accept me for who I am. And when I found Jesus, I knew I found that person. Like, I can't explain, but like that emptiness I felt inside me was instantly filled. And, since then to now, I'm filled with this inner peace that I know that I'm loved, cared for, and protected.
And is this something that you practice on your own? Are you part of a Christian community in Canada?
Yes, I'm part of a Christian community in Canada, and I feel so much connected as, that community connection is vital for, one's well-being as well as spiritual life. So yes, I'm part of the Christian community here.
I'm happy to hear that. So, from my understanding, I'm putting all the pieces together. So, you grew up in Guyana, you went to school. Unfortunately, high school was not accessible for you. So, at some point along the way, you decided Canada would be a better place to pursue the things that you wanted. Now, right now, you work as a sales specialist at Apple Sherway. So, how did you get interested in the position, and how did you get involved?
What involves as a sales specialist, I'm face to face with customer. I do everything as my sighted colleagues, where I speak with the customer and I, probe about their needs and passion. And then based on what they say, I run out their product, I scan it, I process payment, the receipts, and everything just as my sighted colleague, because Apple provided that accessibility for me. The reason I went after Apple, and I got employed not on my first try, but I on my second try. And I pursued Apple because Apple is a company that takes accessibility in their design stage. It's not an afterthought. Like, accessibility is built in all of their products. And I don't have to pay extra just because I use voiceover.
Hmm. Yeah, that actually reminds me that you are also doing an assistive technology apprenticeship. So maybe we'll come back to your role at Apple, but for now, it sounds like learning technology is something that is important to you.
Absolutely. Access technology is my passion. And, when I read about the Access Technology Apprentice program, I was taking lessons with Doug, and I said, Doug, I want to be a part of this program. And Doug told me to send in an application. I sent in my application and cover letter, and then he told me that, I am gonna be one of the next apprentices. And I was like overwhelmed with joy because as I said, I love access technology and, teaching clients something new and having them say how much that has changed their, day-to-day activities is very, very rewarding and fulfilling. And, I didn't know everything, and I still don't know everything when I started. But I've learned so much because when I do my initial intake with the client, I ask them their goals. What do you want to learn? So for the things that I don't know, I researched and I try them out on my own, and then I teach them. So, like for example, I always saw PowerPoint as something that's not doable with a screen reader. I was even afraid to try it. But when I have a client who wants to learn PowerPoint, I had to learn to do it first, right? So I learned to do it, and now I'm able to access PowerPoint presentation with a screen reader. So I'm motivated to teach as well as to learn through this program.
It sounds like helping other people is motivating to learn things for your own and explore new things. That's awesome.
Yes.
So what are some technologies or apps or things like that you find helpful in everyday life?
So I have my smartphone. I'm using Zoom, WhatsApp. I also have my computers. I use JAWS with Windows. I also have a Mac. We use a voiceover. So it's important in my day-to-day life because I work, I volunteer. So I have, their documents to review, their edits to be done, and, assignments to submit when I'm in school. So it's very, very important that I know technology.
Mm-hmm. No, it sounds like you have a lot of different experience. Like you said, maybe there might be something with school that would be better on Windows or other things that would be better on Mac. So it sounds like you were a good fit for the program with your different areas of knowledge with technology.
Yes, each has their, strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to talk to you about your experience going to school, but just to go back to your role at Apple Sherway Gardens. So, you mentioned it was, working with customers and taking receipts and going through products. I guess, what do you find most fulfilling about your job there?
What I find most fulfilling is that, I can work. Like I'm able to, manifest my potential, removing how people see others, with disabilities. I'm able to do the same thing as my sighted colleagues, right? Once the accessibility and the opportunity is there, I'm there to do it, and it's fulfilling. It makes me feel a sense of purpose, like I'm contributing to society as well.
Is that something you feel like you wouldn't have been able to do if you'd stayed in Guyana?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's amazing. I'm really glad to hear. It's neat to kind of hear your perspective on, work. I mean, I've talked to people with disabilities who are employed in Canada, but just hearing that perspective of where you were and where you are now, it's definitely been quite the journey for you.
It has been, yes. And it was not like a walk in the park, so to speak. It was like challenging, but you know what, I found that there's always more than one way to achieve something. If one thing doesn't work, then try something else. Like, for example, when I was seeking after my education and I was told by George Brown they could not accept me into the academic upgrading program because they didn't have a screen reader for me to write the assessment test, I went to TDSB, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I was told by one employer they could not hire me because they weren't sure that my reader would be accessible with their platform, I went somewhere else. I wasn't hired because I didn't have the skill, but because they weren't sure that my screen reader would be, accessible with their platform, and they weren't even willing to try, you know. So there's always more than one way of achieving one's goals and potential.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're making a good point. I think that as much as Canada has those opportunities, there are still systematic barriers that people face to employment. And it is really too bad hearing your story because, it wasn't even that some employers aren't even willing to give it a try, which is too bad because they may miss out on somebody who has the right skills to perform the job. So sounds like for now, your response is to look for other opportunities and find employers that understood how to do accommodations. But yeah, I agree. I hope that other employers catch up to places like Apple in the future.
Yes.
So we were talking a little bit about school along the way. So as I understand, you're taking a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology at York University. Can you tell me about why you picked psychology and then tell us a little bit about the transition to post-secondary education?
So my reason for choosing psychology is when I was back in Guyana, I volunteered for my church as a telephone counselor. And I found that very, very fulfilling and rewarding because, all people need is for someone to listen to them without judgment or, you know, telling others what they've heard. And I was able to listen and, keep their stories confidential. And when they call me back to say, you know what, I feel so much better and thank you for listening, I was like so overwhelmed with joy. I felt that, you know, that fulfillment in doing that. So that's why I chose psychology because the area I'm looking forward to, majoring is in counseling psychology.
So it sounds like you were able to listen to people and you have, in addition to your technology skills, it sounds like you have skills to work with people and that people respond to your approach. So sounds like psychology is a good fit for you.
Yes, that's why I chose that.
And now a message from our sponsor. Discover AMI's collection of podcasts created by and for the blind and partially sighted community. Visit ami.ca to learn more. AMI entertains, informs, and empowers. And now, back to the podcast. So how has it been, applying to York University and pursuing your undergraduate studies?
So it's been a bit challenging, going through all the different, you know, items on a checklist. It's been, you know, some are easy, some are challenging. I'm getting there, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. Um, I do have a student accessibility counselor that I'm talking with. However, there still needs to be more to be done for, to make the process truly accessible and seamless.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a similar idea as with employment. We're coming a long way. We have in Ontario the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and there's been more and more of a push along with disability rights activists to make processes accessible, but not quite there yet in every respect. So,
No, yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Now it seems that when, when a system deals with one person, and that person passes on and the next one comes along, it's like starting over. I'm sure that there are people with vision loss who have attended York already, but it seems like I'm starting over. I have to tell every step of the way what I need and what he seems to know or understand. And it's frustrating.
For sure. Well, I hope that things change in time. That actually brings me to another topic of conversation that I wanted to touch on for today, because from what I understand, you're getting involved in advocacy efforts as well. Is that right?
Yes.
So, why don't we start with the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians? How did you get started with them, and what sorts of work do you do with them?
So I started off volunteering with the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians when I started to look for work in Canada here. So every application asks for work experience. And so, how do you get a work experience if nobody hires you? And then I was advised by someone to, volunteer, and that counts as work experience. So I got involved, and little did I know that that would become the most rewarding and fulfilling work that I can ever do, because I, got involved in accessibility advocacy, and that's where I got my, advocacy skills from. Where today I'm advocating, you know, for accommodations at school, at work, and in every aspect of life. You have to advocate. You have to speak up and let someone know what you need. And the one thing I want to get across is that, you know, people need to ask, not assume, because we are the ones who know exactly how we need to be accommodated. And sometimes, even if we are not asked, we need to speak up. And my work with the Alliance has taught me that, and has enabled me to speak up when I need something and I see something's not working.
Mhm. I'm glad to hear. Is there anything in particular, like an achievement that the Alliance has done that you're proud of?
Yeah, we have done a few City of Toronto funded project, which was one is an employment project where we design and deliver training workshops to employers and employment agencies on how to work and accommodate people with disabilities. So we went to businesses and employment agencies, and one of the businesses we went to was Microsoft. And even though Microsoft is an already inclusive employer, like they learned something from our workshop that they didn't know. We also did another project during the COVID-19 where we were able to give people with vision loss assistive technology like smartphones to stay connected during the pandemic. And we also delivered training workshops on accessible customer service, teaching businesses how to accommodate people with disabilities during the pandemic. How do you tell someone with vision loss to stand on the mark 6 feet apart, right? How does someone with vision loss know that? So we delivered accessible customer service to businesses, and we also delivered accessible education workshops for students as well as educators on universal design learning, which you design something for someone, but then when it's universally designed, it is for everyone. It benefits everyone. And the one thing that I want to get across is that disability touches every demographic and socioeconomic status. And it eventually affects most people in their lifetime through age, illness, or disabilities. So the accommodation one makes today could benefit them tomorrow. And accessibility does not cost anything more for most part when it's from the design stage. it is when it's an afterthought that it costs.
That's a good point. So the whole idea of including people with disabilities in the design process resonates with me as an occupational therapist. I've heard people say the phrase, nothing about us without us. And I do find it frustrating at times when I'm working with clients to know that they have really important things to say, really creative ideas about how the world could be more of an accessible and inclusive place. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that point, Minette, because it's really important to involve people. And, if our society involved more people in the design process, I probably have less work to do myself. So I appreciate the work that you and others at the Alliance are doing to try to call people in and say, include us, and we have contributions to make.
You may not realize this, or others may not realize it, but people with disabilities are excellent problem solvers, because we have to find ways to adapt, day-to-day tasks to, for our own needs, right? Growing up in Guyana without technology, I had to just problem solve, how do I do one thing in a different way? So I had to think and find ways to do things without technology. Like, I use my memory a lot, right? I memorized phone numbers, for example, right? I can go or take a pen and paper and write down a phone number that I need to contact someone important. I memorized it.
Mm-hmm. So, although you have these strategies of memorizing, at the same time, you're making me think about assistive technology, right? And so, if you have sight loss and maybe you have some difficulties with memory, there are different options out there. But I just feel like there's so much more potential we have with technology and design to be more inclusive so that people don't have to put it on themselves to try to problem solve. But to your point, it's true. An important thing I want people to know with listening to this podcast is people don't sit around and wait for things to happen. People are resourceful. People come up with ideas and strategies. And I think it's really important, especially if you're not a member of that disability community, to really sit down and listen to what people are doing and what's working for them before you suggest strategies. So I know we've been talking more about the design piece, but I wanted to mention that as somebody who works in a helping profession as well. And I'm sure, Minette, as an apprentice in this assistive technology program at Balance, I can imagine that that's something that's important for you to explore with the client as well.
Yeah, because each person, learning needs is different. So I have to adapt to teach each person the way they learn best.
Well, for sure. I think actually you also have done accessibility testing. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work as an accessibility tester, who you've worked for, what sorts of things you've tested?
Yeah, so I'm an accessibility tester for Fabletech Labs, and Fabletech is the first company that's given me my my first paid job in Canada. So we evaluate websites and also mobile applications. So we check for accessibility with a screen reader, because I use a screen reader. So we check for the structure of a page. Does it have headings to separate the different sections, the different elements? Does it have unlabeled buttons or links that it just says link here? We don't know what that is. Or are the form fields labeled? Or when you encounter an error when you're filling up a form and it says you know, information missing in red. How do I know that as someone who cannot see, right? It should say information, for example, email information incorrect. Then I know I need to go to the email and correct my email information.
Mhm. So essentially, the work with Fable is making sure that websites and the internet are accessible for people with vision loss or with other disabilities.
Yes.
So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about education, we've talked about employment, we've talked about advocacy. Do you have anything you want to tell listeners who are listening to this podcast and thinking, I want to work, I'd like to go to school, or maybe even I'd like to get involved with advocacy or with technology? What advice do you have for people listening to the podcast based on what you've learned along your journey?
Yeah, I believe everyone has dreams and potentials. And while there may be challenges along the way, I want to encourage everyone to don't give up. As I mentioned earlier, there's always more than one way to achieve something. And you just have to keep trying. Reach out to others who have been through that journey and have their support. And I'm here as a resource also for anyone who wants to be encouraged or need advice on how to achieve and meet their potential.
Well, that's a good note to end the show on. Where can people get in contact with you if they were interested in speaking with you about some of the things we talked about today?
So I am on LinkedIn, also on Facebook. So just look for my name, Minette Samaroo. That's Minette, last name Samaroo, Samaroo.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much, Minette, for coming on the show. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you all the best with your future education and employment goals.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks, Minette. And that wraps up this episode of Living Blind for February 2023. We're glad you could join us. I really hope that you enjoyed this interview with Minette as she took us on a journey through her life story and her lived experience. I know I certainly did. Hearing her journey from where she started, how the odds were stacked against her, and how resilient she is throughout all of her endeavors was really a pleasure to listen to. Special thanks to Minette Samaroo, our producer Jeffrey Rainey, executive producer Deborah Gold, and the entire team at Balance for Blind Adults. And also, let me take a second to thank you, the listener. Our audience has been growing steadily over the past few years on podcast, and we're already seeing viewership on our YouTube channel since we started uploading shows 2 months ago. Feel free to subscribe and give us a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening on. And don't forget to let us know how we're doing. Did you enjoy Minette's story? Is there someone or something you'd like us to talk about in a future episode? Or would you like to be a guest yourself? Find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter by searching Balance for Blind Adults, and chat with other listeners in the Living Blind Listeners Facebook group. You can also email the podcast with any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have at livingblindpodcast@balancefba.org. For more information about Balance for Blind Adults and our programs and services, or to access the show notes and transcription of this episode, please visit us at www.balancefba.org. I'm Naomi Hazlett, and this has been Living Blind, A New Country, A New Life. Thanks for listening.
Are you interested in supporting Balance for Blind Adults? Visit our brand new Ways to Give page at www.balancefba.org. Here, you can learn about social media birthday celebrations, hosting your own event, donating your car, honoring a loved one's memory, and celebrating important milestones like graduations or retirements. There are other great ways to give, like gifts of securities and leaving a gift in your will. And of course, we are always grateful for monthly and one-time gifts. Thank you for helping Balance provide an open world for persons who are blind or living with sight loss.